The Kanawha River does not rush. It moves the way grief moves. Slowly, without announcement, carrying things you didn't know were missing until they are gone. It winds through the hills of West Virginia like a gray thread pulled through dark wool, slipping past coal towns and chemical plants, past church steeples and rusted water towers, past the places where people stopped waiting for things to get better and simply started waiting. On the morning of December 19, 2022, a man named Curtis Owens, 67 years old, retired from the Appalachian Power Company after 31 years, was walking his beagle along the river path on the eastern bank of the Kanawha, 2 miles south of the town of Millhaven, West Virginia. Population: 4,312. The temperature was 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Curtis had his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a canvas jacket. His wife had given him 14 Christmases ago and never once asked him to throw away. He found her caught in the roots of a willow tree that had collapsed into the bank sometime in the previous summer and never been cleared. The roots formed a kind of cradle. Curtis would later tell investigators that for a moment, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10, he thought it was just a pile of clothing, a coat someone had discarded, bag of trash. Then the beagle whimpered and sat down, and Curtis Owens understood that he was looking at a young woman's body, and he began to cry, and his crying was the first human acknowledgement that Maya Cortez, daughter, student, daughter of the soil of this very valley she had spent her short life trying to protect, was gone. I did not know any of this when my editor, Margaret Holloway, called me on a cold January morning and asked if I wanted to look into a missing girl case in West Virginia. I was 42 days sober. I had not slept properly in 3 weeks. I was eating cereal for most of my meals, and I had a stack of unopened mail on my kitchen table that I kept moving from one side to the other, as though rearranging it constituted dealing with it. "What's the angle?" I asked. "I don't know yet," Margaret said. "That's why I'm sending you. I've been a reporter for 16 years. I have covered 3 wars, 2 famines, 1 presidential campaign, and more murders than I can count without sitting down and doing the math. I have developed a specific set of instincts about when a story is bigger than it appears. The feeling is hard to describe, something like a pressure change, the way the air gets heavier before a storm. You feel it in your chest before you feel it anywhere else. I felt it the moment Margaret said the words Millhaven and Hargrove chemical. I felt it, and I said yes, and I drove to West Virginia in a January snowstorm with a full notepad, a recorder, and the particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with cereal. Maya Elena Cortez was born on March 8, 1998, in Charleston, West Virginia, the only child of Elena Cortez, 52, a home health aide, and Roberto Cortez, who died of a heart attack when Maya was 11. She grew up in a small house on Millbrook Lane in the eastern part of Millhaven, in a neighborhood where the houses sat close together and the yards were narrow and the kids played in the street because the nearest park was a 20-minute walk. By every account, her mothers, her teachers, her professors, her friends, Maya Cortez was extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the way that word gets thrown around when someone dies young and everyone rushes to sanctify their memory. Extraordinary in a specific, verifiable, documented way. She graduated valedictorian from Millhaven High School in 2016. She won a full academic scholarship to West Virginia University, where she majored in environmental science with a minor in chemistry. She graduated summa cum laude in 2020, in the middle of a pandemic, and enrolled in WVU's master's program that fall. Her thesis advisor, Dr. Patricia Alvarez, would later describe her to me as the sharpest student she had had in 20 years of teaching, maybe ever. Maya's thesis argued with scientific precision, backed by 18 months of water sample testing, that the Hargrove chemical plant located 6 miles upstream from Millhaven had been leaching hexavalent chromium-6, the same carcinogen made famous by the Aaron Brockovich case in California, into the Millhaven water supply for at least a decade. Possibly longer. She had the data. She had the maps. She had the chain of custody for every sample. She had everything except time. I arrived in Millhaven on a Thursday afternoon in late January. The GPS on my phone lost signal 12 miles out, which I have come to regard as the universe's way of reminding you that you are entering a place that exists on its own terms and does not particularly care about yours. The town materializes gradually rather than all at once. A gas station first, then a diner, Then a row of houses with American flags and nativity scenes that someone had forgotten to take down a month after Christmas. The main street is called Commerce Avenue, which strikes me as optimistic for a street containing an abandoned hardware store, a dollar store, a pharmacy that is also a greeting card shop, and a diner called Patty's. I checked into the Millhaven Motor Lodge, which is not a motor lodge in the traditional sense but rather a converted Victorian house run by a woman named Dolores Pinkham, 71, who informed me at check-in that she charged an extra $5 a night for use of the radiator, and that breakfast was served at 7 sharp and not a minute later. I agreed to these terms and she handed me a room key attached to a plastic fob in the shape of a cardinal. My room smelled like cedar and old wool. It had a window that looked out over a small garden where someone had placed a St. Francis statue surrounded by garden gnomes in what I chose to read as an ecumenical gesture. I sat on the bed for a moment, took out my phone, and looked at the photo of Maya Cortez that her mother had sent me. She was laughing in it. Dark hair pulled back, a streak of sunlight catching her left cheek, a sample collection kit in her hand. She looked like someone who had just been told excellent news and hadn't yet decided how to react to it. She looked like someone who believed that what she was doing mattered. I put the phone down and went to get dinner. The diner was warm and slightly foggy with the smell of coffee and fried onions. A woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the bearing of someone who has been making decisions quickly and correctly for a very long time stood behind the counter. I assumed this was Patty. I was wrong. Patty died in 2014, said the woman. I'm her daughter, Connie. But nobody wants to eat at Connie's, so. She shrugged with a particular philosophical acceptance of someone who has made peace with the fact that life doesn't always name things after you. I ordered the meatloaf and a coffee and a slice of pie that Connie told me was blackberry from her own garden, which meant it was good, and I sat at the counter and listened. A reporter in a new place should always listen before they speak. You learn more from the texture of a room, what people say, what they don't say, how they hold their coffee cups, who they look at when the door opens, than from any amount of direct questioning. What I heard at Patty's was this: 3 men in work boots talking about a deer hunt that had gone badly. A couple in a corner booth having an argument so quiet it was almost inaudible, which always means it's about money. Teenager doing homework on a phone. And from the table behind me, 2 women whose conversation dropped almost entirely to silence when the door opened, and a man in a beige county sheriff's jacket walked in and sat at the far end of the counter. Sheriff Raymond Dunbar was a large man in the particular way of men who were athletic in their 20s and have since added bulk without losing the posture that comes from years of physical confidence. He had gray hair cut close, a face that had spent considerable time outdoors, and eyes that moved around the room the way a man's eyes move when he has learned to pay attention not from curiosity but from a sense that the world contains things that need to be managed. Connie brought him a coffee without him asking. He didn't thank her. He didn't look up when she set it down. He looked at me. I looked back. We held that for maybe 3 seconds, the length of time it takes for 2 people to take each other's measure and decide provisionally what they are dealing with. Then he looked away, and I ate my meatloaf, and the 2 women behind me resumed their conversation, and the teenager went back to their phone, and the night settled around Millhaven like a man pulling a coat closed against the cold. I called Elena Cortez the morning after my arrival and she told me to come at 10. She lived in the same house where Maya had grown up, a 1-story pale yellow structure with a porch where 2 rocking chairs sat facing the street. One chair had a cushion on it. The other did not. I noticed this and understood immediately what it meant. The cushioned chair was Elena's. The other had been Maya's. Elena had not removed it, had not replaced the cushion, had not done anything to that chair except leave it exactly as it was on the last morning Maya sat in it. Elena met me at the door. She was a small woman, compact and still in the way of people who have learned to save their energy for what matters. She had Maya's eyes, dark, precise, watchful, and she wore them now with a weight in them that her daughter's photo didn't have, a heaviness that had settled in since November and showed no sign of leaving. "You want coffee," she said. Not as a pleasantry. As a practical question from a woman who had been through enough to know that the work of sitting across from a stranger and reliving the worst thing that has ever happened to you requires fortification. Said yes. She made it strong. We sat at her kitchen table, which was covered with a plastic tablecloth printed with lemons, and she put her hands flat on the surface and looked at me and said she wanted me to know something before I started asking about Maya. All right, I said. Maya was not reckless. She was not naive. She was not some young girl who didn't understand what she was getting into. She understood exactly. She chose it anyway. Elena's voice was level. It was the voice of a woman who had been saying these words, in various forms, to various people since her daughter disappeared, and who had learned that staying level was the only way to be heard. She told me 2 weeks before she went missing. She said, "Mama, if something happens to me, the data is real. The water is poisoned. They know it and they've known it for years." That's what she said to me. Those exact words. She talked for 3 hours and 20 minutes. I have not, in 16 years of interviewing people in the aftermath of catastrophe, sat across from many people with Elena Cortez's combination of grief and precision. She cried once, briefly, when she described finding Maya's room empty for the first time. She stopped, pressed a paper towel to her eyes, breathed in and continued. She did not apologize for crying. She did not ask me to turn off the recorder. She simply continued, because she had something to say and she had decided to say it, and she was not going to let even her own grief interrupt that. In April 2022, Maya had presented preliminary findings from her thesis research at an academic conference in Morgantown. In the audience was a man named Beaumont, 44, who was identified in the conference program as a community liaison for Hargrove Chemical. Maya had not known he would be there. After her presentation, he approached her and asked, in what she described to her mother as a very friendly way, if she would be willing to share her raw data with the company so they could look into the issue internally. Maya declined. She was polite about it, but she declined. The phone calls started 2 weeks later. She didn't tell me right away, Elena said. She was looking at the lemon tablecloth, her fingers moving slowly over its surface. Maya never wanted me to worry. That was her thing since she was small. She saw how hard I worked after her father died and she never wanted to add to it. So she kept things from me. She thought she was protecting me. She wasn't. She just meant I found out later. The calls, when Elena finally learned about them, were brief. A man's voice, never identified, never traced to a specific individual, telling her that her research contained significant methodological errors and that publishing it would be a serious mistake that could have consequences beyond the academic. Once the voice said, "You grew up here, Maya. Think about your mother. Think about the people you love." "They used my name," Elena said quietly. "They used me against her." She stood abruptly, went to the window, and stood there for a moment looking out at the street. Then she turned back and looked at me with an expression I have rarely seen on a human face, a kind of absolute bone-deep clarity that comes not from the absence of emotion but from emotion that has been refined, over months, into something very pure and very hard. "I need you to understand," she said, "that my daughter went to the sheriff. She went to the authorities. She did everything right. She did every single thing she was supposed to do. And they looked her in the face and they told her to go home." She sat back down. She picked up her coffee. She took a sip. "So now I'm telling you," she said, "because someone has to. To understand what happened to Maya Cortez, you need to understand what Hargrove Chemical means to Millhaven. And to understand that, you need to understand a specific kind of American town. The kind that grew up around a single employer the way a vine grows up a wall, so thoroughly intertwined that by the time you recognize the problem, pulling one away from the other would bring the whole structure down. Hargrove Chemical was founded in 1947 by Carl Hargrove Sr., a former Army engineer who had learned, during the war, that certain chemical processes useful for manufacturing weapons were equally useful for manufacturing industrial solvents and metal treatment compounds. He built the plant on the banks of the Kanawha because the river was convenient for cooling systems and waste disposal, which in 1947 meant what it sounds like it means. At its peak in the 1970s, Hargrove Chemical employed 1,400 people, approximately a third of Millhaven's working population. The Hargrove family built the high school gymnasium. They sponsored the 4th of July parade. They donated the stained glass windows at First Presbyterian. Carl Hargrove Sr.'s photograph hangs in the lobby of Town Hall between a painting of George Washington and a photograph of the moon landing. Carl Sr. died in 1989. His son, Carl Hargrove Jr., 71, inherited the company along with the particular arrogance of a man who has grown up being told that he is owed the world and has found, to his satisfaction, that the world mostly agrees. Junior, as he is known throughout Millhaven, a nickname that carries both familiarity and the permanent condescension of a diminutive, has run Hargrove Chemical for 34 years. During those 34 years, the company has been cited 11 times by the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection for various violations. Each time the company paid a fine. Each time, the violations were described in subsequent reports as remediated. I reviewed all 11 citation reports. I reviewed the subsequent remediation reports. I reviewed the water quality testing data submitted by the company to state regulators going back to 2004. What I found, with the help of Dr. Marcus Chen, an independent environmental scientist at Carnegie Mellon University, is this. The company's self-reported water quality data shows chromium levels consistently at or just below the EPA maximum contaminant level for 19 consecutive years. That pattern, consistently just below the threshold for 2 decades, is not plausible, Dr. Chen told me. Real-world contamination doesn't work like that. Fluctuates, spikes. The fact that the numbers are always just at the edge of acceptable, that's not data. That's a number someone decided to write down. Maya Cortez's independent testing showed chromium levels 3 to 8 times the EPA maximum. The difference between Maya's numbers and the company's numbers is not a rounding error. It is not a methodological discrepancy. It is the difference between regulatory compliance and mass poisoning. And the question of whether Maya's data is accurate has a short answer. Yes. I had her samples independently retested by 2 separate certified laboratories. The results matched her original findings to within a margin of error of 4%. The water in Millhaven is poisoned. The company knows. And Maya Cortez died before she could tell the world. I drove to the Hargrove chemical plant on my 3rd day in Millhaven. It sits on the river like a declaration of permanence, a cluster of tanks, cooling towers, and processing buildings surrounded by chain-link fence. I had requested an interview with Carl Hargrove Jr. His assistant had told me the company had no comment on ongoing investigative matters. What I got instead was Marcus Webb. Webb emerged from the main building wearing a hard hat. He hadn't bothered to adjust to his head size and a company fleece. He was a compact, careful-looking man with a particular manner of someone who has been trained to speak to press, cooperative enough to seem reasonable, guarded enough to say nothing. He told me the plant was fully compliant with all state and federal regulations. He told me Maya Cortez's research had significant methodological issues. He told me the company's deepest sympathies were with the Cortez family during this tragic time. I asked him what methodological issues specifically. He said he wasn't in a position to discuss the technical details. I asked him whether the 4 phone calls made from a Hargrove chemical number to Maya Cortez's cell phone were placed by him or by someone else. Something changed in Marcus Webb's face. Just a slight tightening around the eyes, a fractional pause before his next breath. If you hadn't been watching for it, you would have missed it. I wouldn't know anything about that, he said. I asked him if he knew who Harris Beaumont was. I have to get back to work, Marcus Webb said. He turned and walked back into the plant, and the security guard watched me until I drove away. I sat in my rental car at the end of the plant's access road for 10 minutes, looking at the cooling towers and thinking about the Kanawha River running behind them, and what it had carried for the last 20 years, and who had known and who had looked away. I made 4 separate attempts to interview Sheriff Raymond Dunbar before he agreed to speak with me. On my 4th attempt, I arrived at 7:15 in the morning before anyone else was in the building and waited. Dunbar arrived at 7:43 and found me sitting in the plastic chair outside his office door. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who has developed, over a long career, a comprehensive tolerance for unpleasantness. "You're the reporter," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, sir." He unlocked his office, went in, and left the door open. I took that as an invitation. His office had the specific atmosphere of authority that has been in place long enough to become scenery. Certificates on the walls. A mounted base. Photo with a governor. Another photo with another governor. He poured himself a coffee and did not offer me one. "What do you want to know?" he said. "I want to know why you didn't take Maya Cortez's complaint seriously." The sheriff took a sip of his coffee and hurried. "I took her complaint seriously. I assessed the situation and determined there was no credible threat. She told you she'd received threatening phone calls from Hargrove Chemical. She told me she'd received calls from a number she believed to be associated with Hargrove. I spoke with the plant manager. They said it was a courtesy call about some research concerns. Nothing threatening." "You spoke with the plant manager," I said. I let that sit for a moment. "You didn't speak with Maya's thesis advisor, who could have confirmed the academic legitimacy of her research? That wasn't relevant to a harassment complaint. I had in my bag a copy of Maya's journal. I quoted from it directly. He told me to be careful about making accusations against people who have more lawyers than I have sense." Dunbar's jaw tightened. "I don't recall saying anything like that." She wrote it down that same evening. People write down their impressions. Their impressions aren't always accurate. There was a silence. Outside the window, a truck went by on Commerce Avenue, its engine noise filling the room briefly and then fading. Dunbar looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked at me, and I saw, for just a moment, something behind the professional composure. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. Flicker. "I've been the sheriff of this county for 19 years, he said. "I've done right by this community." "I'm sure you have," I said. "And I'm asking you about this specific case, in which a 24-year-old woman came to you for help and was dead 3 weeks later." He stood up. "The interview was over. My office has cooperated fully with the state police investigation. I have nothing further to add." I thanked him for his time and left. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and wrote everything down while it was fresh. My hands were slightly unsteady. Not from fear. From the specific anger that comes from sitting across from someone with the authority to have saved a life and the knowledge that they didn't use it. It was Connie at Patty's Diner who told me about Tamara Elkins. "She was Maya's friend," Connie said on my 4th evening in Millhaven, refilling my coffee without being asked. "They grew up together. You should talk to her." "Does she want to talk?" "Yes." Connie looked at me over the coffee pot. "She's been wanting to talk for months. She just needed someone to talk to who could actually do something about it." Tamara Elkins met me the next morning at a picnic table behind the dollar store, which she had chosen because it had a clear view of the street in both directions and was not visible from the sheriff's office. She was 29 years old, small, with the careful bearing of someone who has been looking over her shoulder for long enough that it has become habitual. "Maya and I were best friends since 2nd grade, she said. "We did everything together until high school, and then she went on to college and I stayed here and we saw each other less, but she always called me when she came home." She always called. Tamara stopped. She looked at the street. She continued. "In September, 2 months before she disappeared, she called me and asked if I could meet her. She sounded different. I can't describe it exactly. Like she was trying to sound normal, but something underneath was different. They met at Elena's house, in the kitchen with a lemon tablecloth. Maya had a folder. Inside the folder were printed pages of data, water quality readings, sample collection logs, a map of the Kanawha with sampling points marked in red. She spread it on the table and walked Tamara through it, patient and methodical, the way she must have presented it to her thesis committee. She said, "Tamara, the water here is making people sick. It's been doing it for years." She showed me these cancer clusters, cases of bladder cancer and stomach cancer and cervical cancer, concentrated in the neighborhoods closest to the river. She'd mapped them herself. Tamara reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it and slid it across the picnic table to me. It was a photocopy of Maya's map, with the sampling points in red and the cancer cases marked in blue circles. Tamara had kept it. She'd kept it for a year, through the disappearance and the recovery of the body and the months of inaction that followed. She gave me a copy, Tamara said. She said if anything happens, make sure someone sees this. She was making copies, giving them to people she trusted. I asked Tamara if she had tried to give the map to anyone. I gave it to Sheriff Dunbar, Tamara said flatly. He told me it was a matter for the State Environmental Agency and that he'd pass it along. He didn't pass it along. Called the agency. They had no record of any referral from his office. I asked Tamara if she'd been threatened. She looked at me for a moment. Then she pulled back the sleeve of her jacket and showed me her left forearm. There was a scar there, pale and healed, about 2 inches long. Car accident, she said. 4 months ago. A black pickup truck ran me off Route 7. Witnesses said it was deliberate. The driver was never identified. Did you report it? To Sheriff Dunbar, she said, and the way she said it contained the entire answer. I looked at the scar and then I looked at Tamara Elkins and I thought about what it costs a person to keep carrying a piece of paper for a year, to keep showing up at a table behind a dollar store, to keep insisting that something happened and demanding that someone finally listen. I'm going to tell your story, I told her. She looked at me with those careful eyes. You're going to tell Maya's story, she said. That's the one that matters. Maya Cortez kept a journal. Not a diary in the traditional sense. Not a record of feelings and events in neat chronological order, but a working document, part research notes and part personal account, in which she recorded observations, anxieties, conversations, and discoveries with the same discipline she applied to her academic work. Her mother gave me access to it. She made me wear cotton gloves to handle it, which I understood as respect rather than precaution. The journal is a black composition notebook, standard size, filled front to back in Maya's handwriting. Small, even, surprisingly precise for a document written in private. I read it twice front to back in one sitting. April 3, 2022. The man from Hargrove approached me after the panel. Harris Beaumont. I looked him up. He's described as a community liaison, which seems to be a corporate term for someone who manages threats. He was friendly the way people are friendly when they're deciding something. Offered to have the company review my data. Said no. I was polite, but I said no. He didn't like that. You could tell. He said, we all want what's best for Millhaven. Said yes we do. He left. My hands were shaking afterward and I don't entirely know why. May 17, 2022. Fourth call. Same voice. He said, this research could hurt people who depend on that plant for their livelihood. Is that what you want? To take food off people's tables? I said environmental protection was its own form of caring for people's livelihoods. He said, that's a very academic answer for a girl from Millhaven. Hung up. Then I sat with my back against the wall for 20 minutes because my legs wouldn't work properly. Then I made a list of everything I needed to do. Lists help. August 8, 2022. Someone has been in my apartment. Nothing taken, nothing obvious. But my files were not in the order I left them. I know how I organize things. The water sample documentation was in the wrong order. The third folder was where the second should be. I know how I organize things. I am not imagining this. I took everything relevant to Mom's house. I trust Mom's house more than I trust my apartment. October 12, 2022. Went to see Sheriff Dunbar. I prepared everything carefully. The call log, the notes, the description of the break-in. He listened. Or he appeared to listen. Then he said something I will not forget. That I should be careful making accusations against people who have more lawyers than I have sense. He said it calmly. He wasn't being cruel. That was almost worse. He said it as if it were a kindness. As if he was telling me something helpful. I drove home and sat in my mother's kitchen, and I thought about all the people in Millhaven who have drunk that water for 20 years. The Hendersons on River Road. Their daughter has bladder cancer at 31. The Marshes. The Okafor family. All the people who've been sick and didn't know why and went to the doctor and got a diagnosis and went home and got sicker. They deserved to know. That's it. That's all I want. I want them to know. October 28, 2022. I'm sending copies of the full data set to 3 different people. Professor Alvarez has one. Tamara has part of it. I'm mailing the rest to my mother with instructions in an envelope marked open if you need to. I'm not trying to be dramatic. I want the data to survive. Whatever happens, the data should survive. The last entry in the journal is dated November 1, 2022. It is one sentence. I am scared, but I am not going to stop. 2 days later, her mother reported her missing. The formal investigation into Maya Cortez's disappearance was, from the beginning, defined by what it failed to do. The case was initially handled by Sheriff Dunbar. He designated it a missing persons case. No immediate criminal investigation was opened. Maya's apartment was not treated as a potential crime scene for the first 9 days after her disappearance. I obtained, through a public records request, the complete file of the initial sheriff's office response. It runs to 47 pages. 41 of those pages are administrative forms. There are 6 pages of actual investigative notes, and one of which contains Sheriff Dunbar's own handwritten notation in the margin reading, "No foul play evident at this time." He wrote that on day 2, before there was any evidence of anything. The West Virginia State Police took over the case on November 19, 16 days after Maya was reported missing, after Elena Cortez drove to the state capitol and sat in the lobby of the state police headquarters until someone agreed to see her. Sergeant Donna Marcello, 38, the investigator assigned to the case, told me that when she received the file from the sheriff's office, she described it to her supervisor as almost deliberately inadequate. "What I can tell you," Sergeant Marcello said carefully, "is that the early response did not follow standard protocols for a case involving a potential threat to the missing person." I asked Sergeant Marcello if the state police investigation had examined Hargrove Chemicals' possible connection to Maya's disappearance. She looked at me steadily. "Our investigation examined all relevant leads." "Has anyone from Hargrove Chemical been interviewed as part of the investigation?" "I can't comment on specific investigative activities." "Has Harris Beaumont been interviewed?" "I can't comment." "Has Carl Hargrove Jr. been interviewed?" Sergeant Marcello said very quietly, "I would encourage you to continue asking the questions you're asking. I would encourage you to do so publicly. That's all I can say." I drove back to Millhaven with that ringing in my ears. Maya's map had blue circles. I spent 2 weeks following those blue circles. The circles represented cancer diagnoses Maya had collected through a combination of state health department records, publicly available obituaries, and interviews conducted during her research. She had identified 23 cases of bladder, stomach, and cervical cancers in the neighborhoods closest to the Kanawha River. Cases diagnosed between 2010 and 2022 in a population of approximately 800 people. A national background rate for those cancers combined would predict, statistically, between 4 and 7 cases in a population of that size over that period. 23 is not 4. 23 is not 7. I visited 11 of the families on Maya's list. One man, Leonard Okafor, 58, whose wife Caroline had died of bladder cancer in 2019 at age 54, looked at my press credentials and said, "Nobody cares about US," with the tone of a person stating a fact they verified repeatedly. "I care," I told him. "That's what the last person said," Leonard Okafor told me, and I understood without asking that he meant Maya. He talked to me for an hour and a half. He told me about Caroline, about how she'd grown up on the river, swimming in it in summer, drinking the water that came out of the tap, never imagining that the water she trusted was slowly, systematically destroying her from the inside out. She was 51 when they found it, he said. We were sitting on his back porch, looking out over a yard that backed onto a creek tributary. She'd had symptoms for 2-3 years by then. Kept thinking it was something else. By the time they found it, it was stage 3. He was quiet for a moment. His hands were on his knees and he was looking at the creek. "She fought so hard," he said. And then, more quietly, "She was the strongest person I ever knew." I thought of Elena Cortez saying the same thing about Maya. I thought about the particular way that strength looks in women who are fighting things that should not require fighting, who are expending every ounce of what they have on problems that other people created and other people refused to solve. I asked Leonard if he knew about Maya's research. She came here, he said. Twice. She sat right where you're sitting. She tested our water. She said, Mr. Okafor, I want you to know that what happened to your wife was not random. It wasn't bad luck. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows what caused it. She was 23 years old and she sat here and she said that and I believed her. He looked at me. His eyes were dry but there was something in them that was harder to look at than tears. Then she disappeared, he said. And nobody's said her name since except her mother and me. I'm saying it now, Leonard. I'm saying it as loudly as I know how. Harris Beaumont was harder to find than I expected. He was not listed on the Hargrove chemical website. It took a records researcher at our newspaper 3 days to establish that Beaumont was employed not directly by Hargrove Chemical, but by a consulting firm that had Hargrove Chemical as its primary client for at least 6 of its 7 years of existence. Beaumont lived in a subdivision outside Charleston, in a brick house with a 2-car garage and a basketball hoop in the driveway that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. I knocked on his door on a Tuesday morning. He opened it wearing work pants and a fleece and he looked at me with a very specific expression, the expression of someone who has been expecting an unpleasant visitor for a long time and is surprised only that they haven't arrived sooner. I told him who I was and what I was investigating. He stood in the doorway for a very long moment. Then he stepped aside and let me in. We sat at his kitchen table. His wife was not home. His kids were at school. He made coffee and he sat down and he put his hands on the table and he looked at them. I need to know if you're recording this, he said. I told him I was, and that anything he said could be used in the story. He nodded. He drank his coffee. And then, slowly, haltingly, with the careful manner of a man who is picking his way across ice and listening for cracks, he began to talk. What Harris Beaumont told me is that he was aware that there was a problem with the water. Not the specifics of Maya's data but the general fact of it. He had known, he said, since approximately 2018, when an internal audit commissioned by Hargrove Chemical and then suppressed had indicated elevated chromium levels in downstream water. I wasn't involved in the decision to suppress it, he said. I want to be clear about that. But you knew it was suppressed. He was quiet for a moment. Yes. And the phone calls to Maya Cortez. Were you involved in those? Another pause. Longer. He was looking at his hands. My job, he said carefully, was to identify potential threats to the company's regulatory standing and manage them. That was my job description. Manage was the word used. What did manage mean specifically in Maya's case? Contact her. Assess the scope of her research. Determine if there was a possibility of academic or legal action, and advise the company accordingly. Did you threaten her? He looked up. I didn't threaten her. I never threatened her. The calls were pressure. I want to be honest about that. They were designed to discourage her. But I never threatened her directly. I never told anyone to harm her. Do you know who did? Harris Beaumont put his face in his hands. He stayed there for a moment. When he looked up, there were no tears but the expression underneath them was the expression of a man who has been carrying a specific, crushing weight for a very long time and can feel it finally, irreversibly, beginning to shift. I think you need to talk to Marcus Webb, he said. And I think you need to talk to him in a way that makes it clear you already know what happened. Because he won't tell you if he thinks he has a choice. Why are you telling me this? Yes. He looked at me. Because I have a daughter, he said. She's 9. And when I look at her He stopped. He put his hands flat on the table again. Maya Cortez went to the sheriff and he turned her away. She went to the authorities and they failed her. I'm telling you because the press is the only authority that's left. And because I've been living with this for a year and I can't anymore. We spoke for 2 hours. He agreed to go on record. He agreed to provide a written statement to the state police. When I left his house, he was sitting at his kitchen table with his phone in his hand, and I didn't need to ask who he was calling. After my conversation with Harris Beaumont, I contacted Marcus Webb again. I sent him an email telling him I had spoken with Beaumont, that I had the internal audit from 2018, that I had independently verified Maya's water test results, and that I was giving him 72 hours to respond. He called me from a personal cell phone 14 hours later, at 11:30 at night. His voice was different from our meeting at the plant. The careful competence was gone. What was underneath it was something I recognized from other conversations I have had with people at the moment when the constructed version of events they've been living inside finally collapses. A raw, exhausted, almost relieved desperation. "I didn't hurt her," he said. That was the first thing he said. "Then help me understand what happened to her," I said. What emerged over the next 90 minutes was this. Marcus Webb had known about the contamination since 2009. He had personally overseen the handling of the data that went to the state regulators, the data that showed chromium levels consistently, impossibly, just below the threshold. He had not falsified it himself, he said. He had been given numbers by a supervisor and told to file them. He had done so for 14 years. When Maya's research began to surface in 2022, Webb had been in the room when Hargrove Jr. made the decision to employ Beaumont's firm. He had heard the conversation. He had heard the words neutralize the threat used without any apparent awareness of how those words would sound. "I should have said something then," Webb told me. "I know that. I knew it then. I didn't." I asked him what he knew about Maya's disappearance specifically. He was silent for a long time. "There are things I know and things I only think I know," he said finally. "What I can tell you is that in the last week of October, Hargrove Jr. and Beaumont had a meeting that I was not invited to attend. That was unusual. After that meeting, Beaumont left Millhaven. He didn't come back for 2 weeks. When he came back, something was different about him. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He resigned 6 months later. What do you think happened in that meeting?" "I think," Marcus Webb said slowly, "that someone made a decision about how to handle the problem. And I think that Beaumont realized after the fact exactly what kind of problem they thought they were handling." I asked Webb if he would provide this account to the state police. He said yes. He said it quietly, like someone agreeing to something they've needed to agree to for a long time. Carl Hargrove Jr. agreed to an interview on a Thursday afternoon in March, 3 months after I arrived in Millhaven. His lawyer was present. The interview took place in the conference room of his company's administrative offices, a space decorated with framed photographs of the plant at various stages of its history, and a large map of West Virginia with Millhaven marked by a gold star. Hargrove Jr. at 71 had the appearance of a man who had never seriously doubted his own judgment. He was well dressed in the understated way of old money. Gray slacks, a collared shirt, no tie. His handshake was firm. His eye contact was steady. He had the practiced ease of someone who has conducted many difficult conversations from a position of perceived safety, and expects this one to be no different. I asked Hargrove Jr. about the 2018 internal audit. He said he had no recollection of an internal audit in 2018. I slid a copy of the audit across the table. It had been provided to me by Marcus Webb, who had kept a personal copy. Hargrove Jr. looked at it. He looked at his lawyer. He looked at me. "I'd need to have our team review this document before commenting," he said. I asked him about the phone calls to Maya Cortez. "The company had concerns about the academic accuracy of her research," he said. "Those concerns were communicated professionally through appropriate channels. The woman who received those calls described them as threatening," I said. "That was not the intent. We regret if she interpreted them that way." I asked him when he last saw Maya Cortez. He paused. Very brief pause. "I don't believe I ever met the young woman personally. Do you know what happened to Maya Cortez?" His lawyer moved to speak. Hargrove Jr. raised one hand slightly, stopping him. He looked at me with those steady eyes. "A young woman died," he said. "That is a tragedy. Our sympathies are with her family." "That's not what I asked." Silence. "That's all we'll be saying today," the lawyer said, and gathered his papers, and the interview was over. I sat in my rental car in the parking lot of Hargrove Chemical for 15 minutes. The cooling towers steamed against the gray March sky. Somewhere behind those towers, the Kanawha moved south, carrying its invisible freight, indifferent and patient. I thought about Maya Cortez, sitting in the same parking lot in her car, with her sample kits and her notebooks and her absolute refusal to pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. I thought about what it must have felt like to be 24 and alone and right, to have the data and the clarity and the certainty, and to be met on every side by people who had chosen, systematically and deliberately, not to care. I thought about her last journal entry. I am scared, but I am not going to stop. I wasn't going to stop either. The official cause of death for Maya Cortez, as determined by the West Virginia State Medical Examiner's Office, is listed as drowning. The manner of death is listed as undetermined. Not accident. Not homicide. Undetermined. Dr. Helen Park, 54, Deputy State Medical Examiner, conducted the autopsy. The report shows that Maya Cortez died of drowning. The water in her lungs was consistent with Kanawha River water. There was blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, described in the report as consistent with impact against a hard surface. There was no water in the stomach, which Dr. Park confirmed to me is clinically significant. It suggests Maya may not have been conscious when she entered the water. Maya was also, as I noted at the beginning of this account, 3 months pregnant. The trauma to the skull, I asked Dr. Park, is it consistent with a blow from behind? It is not inconsistent with that scenario, yes. And the absence of water in the stomach, in your professional opinion, does that change the likelihood of a voluntary versus involuntary entry into the water? Dr. Park was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in my professional opinion, the findings are more consistent with an involuntary entry into the water than with a voluntary one. That is my opinion. It is documented in the supplemental notes to the report. Those notes were provided to the state police. I asked her why the manner of death was listed as undetermined rather than as suspicious. She said carefully that the determination was made based on the totality of available evidence at the time of filing. I asked her if she agreed with that determination. I filed the report, Dr. Park said. And then, almost inaudibly, I stand by my supplemental notes. I found the supplemental notes in the public record 20 minutes after our conversation ended. They had been classified as internal review only by the state police case manager, not Dr. Park, whose name appears only on the original filing. The case manager who classified those notes was assigned from the Millhaven County Sheriff's Office as a liaison to the state police investigation. His name was Deputy Gary Corwin. He has worked under Sheriff Raymond Dunbar for 11 years. I went back to see Elena Cortez on a Saturday in April. It was raining in the particular steady way of Appalachian spring rain, and the house on Millbrook Lane looked gray and patient in the wet light. She met me at the door with coffee already made, as though she had known I was coming, and we sat at the lemon tablecloth again, and I told her what I had found. I told her about the internal audit, about Marcus Webb, about Harris Beaumont, about the medical examiner's supplemental notes, about Deputy Corwin and the classified documents. I told her about the cancer cluster, about Leonard Okafor and Caroline, dead at 54. Elena Cortez sat across from me and listened to all of it without interrupting. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was still. She was doing what she had done since November, holding herself perfectly, precisely together, because falling apart was a luxury she could not afford when there was still work to be done. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She knew all of this, Elena said finally. She knew most of it before she disappeared. She had put it together. She was 24 years old, and she had put the whole thing together, and she was ready to go public with it. Yes, I said. And they knew she was ready. Yes. Elena nodded. She looked at the tablecloth. She looked up. I need you to understand something, she said. Maya was not just my child. Of course she was my child. She was everything I have. But she was a person who made a choice with full knowledge of what it might cost. She decided that the people of this town had a right to know what was in their water. She decided that was worth the risk. She was 24 years old and she made that decision. I am proud of her beyond anything I have words for. I am proud of her and I am destroyed by losing her, and both of those things are completely true at the same time. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and put something on the table between us. It was a key on a simple silver ring. The key to her apartment, Elena said. Before the state police cleared it, I went in and I took everything I thought might matter. The notebooks, the sample documentation, the copies she'd made. She pushed the key toward me slightly. Whatever you need to finish this, she said. Whatever I have. It's yours. I picked up the key and I held it for a moment. It was very light, small and ordinary, the kind of key that opens millions of ordinary doors in millions of ordinary places where ordinary people live their ordinary lives. Except that this one had belonged to Maya Cortez, who had been anything but ordinary, and who had deserved an ordinary life and a chance to live it, and had not been given one. I'll finish it, I told Elena. She nodded. She refilled my coffee. We sat there in the rain. The apartment was a second-floor walk-up in a converted Victorian on the east side of Morgantown, near the WVU campus. Elena opened the door and then stepped back and let me go in first, which I understood meant she did not want to watch me see it for the first time. The apartment was small and clean and full of the particular personality of a person who lived entirely in their work. Books everywhere, environmental science texts, chemistry references, Erin Brockovich's memoir, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, its spine broken from multiple readings. A whiteboard on the kitchen wall with equations and abbreviations in 3 colors of marker. On the desk, a photograph of Elena. On the windowsill, 3 small plants in terracotta pots, bone dry now, but someone, Elena, I realized, had recently watered one of them, the one closest to the window. In the files Elena had preserved, I found things I had not expected. I found a complete chain of custody log for every water sample Maya had collected. 47 samples, 7 collection points over 18 months. I found a draft letter to the EPA regional administrator, ready to be sent, dated November 2nd, dated the day before she disappeared. I found a folder labeled legal containing information she had gathered about whistleblower protection laws, environmental law firms, the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. She had highlighted sections in yellow, dog-eared pages, written notes in the margins. She had been preparing to go further. She had a plan. She had a next step. She was ready. And in the bottom drawer of her desk, under a stack of blank notebooks, I found one more thing. A USB drive, taped inside a card envelope. On the envelope, in Maya's handwriting. For the journalist. Whoever you are, use it. The USB drive contained the complete, unredacted dataset from her thesis research, including the independent lab reports, the sample photographs, the GPS coordinates of every collection point, and 3 audio recordings. In the first recording, Maya's voice, clear, young, with a particular Appalachian lilt I had heard in the voices of everyone I'd spoken to in Millhaven, reads aloud from her data summary, annotating it for a non-scientific audience. She sounds like a teacher. She sounds like someone who has spent time thinking about how to explain something complicated to someone who needs to understand it. In the second recording, she describes the phone calls. Her voice is calm, but the calmness is constructed. You can hear the effort in it. The voice on the phone said my mother's name, she says. That's when I understood this was not a professional disagreement. That's when I understood that I was a problem they intended to solve. In the third recording, she is speaking directly to the listener. She says, if you're hearing this, something has happened to me, and you have what you need to tell the truth. The data is real. The contamination is real. People who are sick are real. Please don't let them reduce this to politics or liability or academic dispute. This is about people drinking water from their tap and trusting that it's safe. That trust was broken. That trust has been broken for 20 years. I need you to tell them. I need you to say it clearly. The water in Millhaven is poisoned and the people responsible have known for 20 years and they chose their profits over people's lives. Say it clearly. Don't soften it. Say it exactly that way. I sat in Maya Cortez's apartment and I listened to that recording 4 times. Elena was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving quietly, watering the plants. I did not cry, but I wanted to. I have learned over 16 years of this work to do my crying later. At home alone after the story is filed and the sources are protected and the work is done. Crying in the field is not something I allow myself. Gets in the way. But I want to be clear that the desire to cry was present. That it was appropriate. That anyone who listened to that recording and did not feel it would have something wrong with them. Maya Cortez made that recording knowing she might not survive to see what she'd found made public. She made it anyway. She organized it so clearly. She thought about the journalist who would come. She was thinking about me, about whoever I was, while she was still alive and preparing for the possibility that she wouldn't be. That is not the act of someone naive about the risks she was taking. That is the act of someone who has made her peace with those risks and is trying to make sure that her work survives her. Here it is. The water in Millhaven, West Virginia has been contaminated with hexavalent chromium at levels 3 to 8 times the federal legal maximum for at least a decade. The company responsible has known this and has actively concealed it from regulators, the public, and the people of Millhaven who have been drinking it. At least 23 people in the affected area have been diagnosed with cancers associated with chromium-6 exposure. At least 6 have died. A young woman who discovered this and refused to stay quiet is dead. The people responsible have names. Their names are in this account. They have had the opportunity to respond. The river is still running. The water is still poisoned. The people of Millhaven are still drinking it. On the last day of my time in Millhaven, I drove out to the eastern bank of the Kanawha, 2 miles south of town, to the place where Curtis Owens had found Maya Cortez on a December morning when the temperature was 22 degrees and his beagle sat down and refused to go further. The willow tree was still there, still collapsed into the bank. Someone had been here since December. There were flowers, plastic-wrapped but still vivid, tied to the exposed roots. A photograph in a waterproof sleeve. Maya's face again, that same photo, the sunlight and the laughter and the sample kit and the look of someone who had just been told excellent news. I stood there for a while. The river moved past, gray and unhurried. Across the water, the cooling towers of Hargrove Chemical stood against the sky. A heron stood motionless on a sandbar 20 yards downstream, absolutely still, watching the water, waiting. I thought about what Elena had said. She was scared, but she was not going to stop. I thought about the USB drive and the recording and Maya's voice, patient and clear, explaining her data to the journalist she had imagined but never met. Thinking of me, thinking of you, hearing this now while she was still alive. Making sure the work would survive her. I thought about Tamara Elkins carrying a map in her bag for a year. About Leonard Okafor on his porch, looking at the creek. About Elena watering Maya's plants. I thought about all the people whose names are not in this story. The ones who are sick and don't know why, who have gone to their doctors and gotten their diagnoses and gone home and drunk their water and trusted that the world was working the way it was supposed to work. The ones who will hear this and understand, perhaps for the first time, that it wasn't. That the water they trusted was not safe. That someone knew it and chose to keep quiet. That is a heavy thing to tell people. But they deserve the truth. They have always deserved it. Maya Cortez knew that. She gave everything she had to deliver it. The heron on the sandbar moved, sudden and decisive, and was gone, up and over the water and out of sight before I had time to track where it went. The river kept moving. The cooling towers kept steaming. The willow roots held their impossible cradle over the water, and the photograph of Maya Cortez smiled out from its waterproof sleeve at the river she had measured and documented and died trying to protect. I put my hand on the photograph for a moment, just for a moment, and then I walked back to my car and I drove back to the Millhaven Motor Lodge, and I sat at the small desk in my cedar-smelling room and I opened my laptop and I started to write. In the months that followed the publication of this account, the following things happened. The EPA regional investigation into Hargrove Chemical found chromium contamination consistent with Maya Cortez's data at all 7 collection points. The company was issued an emergency compliance order. Millhaven's municipal water system was placed under a federally supervised bottled water distribution program while infrastructure upgrades were completed. The West Virginia State Police homicide investigation resulted in the arrest of a private security contractor with documented ties to Hargrove Chemical, on charges of second-degree murder. The investigation into who ordered and financed his activities is ongoing. Carl Hargrove Jr. was indicted on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice and criminal negligence in connection with the water contamination. Sheriff Raymond Dunbar resigned, citing health reasons, and is under separate investigation for obstruction of justice. Deputy Gary Corwin was suspended pending investigation. Harris Beaumont and Marcus Webb both entered into cooperation agreements with prosecutors and agreed to testify at trial. Elena Cortez's civil suit against Hargrove Chemical resulted in a settlement of $47 million. Elena donated the entirety of her share to the establishment of the Maya Cortez Environmental Justice Fund, a non-profit supporting young researchers from Appalachian communities working on environmental science. Leonard Okafor attended the announcement of the EPA investigation wearing a photograph of Caroline pinned to his jacket. When a reporter asked how he was feeling, he said simply, "Like she finally got what she deserved. Both of them." Tamara Elkins is still in Millhaven. She still works at the dollar store. She has started a local citizens' environmental monitoring group. They test the water every month. They share the results publicly. Elena Cortez still lives at 14 Millbrook Lane. The rocking chair without a cushion is still on the porch. She has not removed it, and she does not intend to. Maya Cortez's thesis was posthumously awarded the degree of Master of Science in Environmental Science with highest distinction. The degree certificate was accepted at the ceremony by Elena Cortez, who wore a dress the same color as the stripe of sunlight in her daughter's photograph. Dr. Patricia Alvarez, Maya's thesis advisor, spoke at the ceremony. She said, "Maya Cortez did the work of a scientist, the work of a citizen, and the work of a human being who refused to accept that proximity to power was more important than proximity to truth. She was right. She was always right. And it is both the greatest honor and the most profound sorrow of my career to say her name today in this room." The Kanawha River runs south. It is cleaner now than it was a year ago, though the work of remediation will take years. It is not what it should be. It is better than it was. That is not justice. Justice would be Maya Cortez alive and credited and here to see the fruit of what she planted. Justice would be Elena not having an empty rocking chair on her porch. Justice would be Caroline Okafor alive and watching the creek from her backyard. This is not justice. It is accountability, which is different. Slower, smaller, insufficient, and still necessary. We keep going because we have to. 'Cause Maya said so. Because the data is real and the people are real, and the weight of silence, once you have felt it, is no longer something you are able to carry without putting it down somewhere public, somewhere it can be seen. I am putting it down here. I am scared, but I am not going to stop. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe my channel.